All right, so in this video lesson, we're going to be solving the constructing promises challenge. And so here we're going to be creating our first promise. And a promise is basically a construct in the language which is used to wrap some future value. And the promise is, you can think of a promise like a wrapper or a container that you can put a value in, and at the time, the value is not actually known yet. So the value is something that will be determined later in the future. And the promise is basically something which can hold that value until it is determined in the future. And so in this lesson, we're going to be creating our own promise and seeing a little bit more about how to do that and how promises work. So the basic way to create a promise is that you use the promise constructor and the new keyword. So we want to create a new promise called myPromise, and this is going to be equal to a new promise. Okay, and then if we open the parentheses here, we'll see that we have this promise constructor accepting this executor function argument, and this is basically the type signature that we have provided here in the editor. And if we look at the comment here, it says that this argument is a callback used to initialize the promise. This callback is passed two arguments: a resolve callback used to resolve the promise with a value or the result of another promise, and a reject callback used to reject the promise with a provided reason or error. And then of course this returns the newly created promise. So what does all of this mean? What it basically means is, if you think about the promise as a wrapper for some future value, what you want to do is you want to pass in some information or some other code to the promise when you create it in order for the promise to use once it has that future value. So you can basically think that the promise is going to be waiting for some value to be fulfilled, or potentially fail. So there's basically some operation that's happening that's going to complete in the future. And when you create the promise, you need to tell the promise what to do when that operation is completed or when it fails. And that's what we're going to pass in as a function to our promise constructor. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. Let me just comment out this line for now, and then I'm going to create a new function here called promise callback. And this is going to be of the type of this function signature we have here, the promise executor function. And so this is going to be a regular function, as we've seen before. And this function is going to accept two arguments: a resolve argument and a reject argument. And the names resolve and reject are just basically the kind of conventional names used for these two functions in a promise. Because these are arguments to a function here, we could name them whatever we want, but it is pretty standard to name them resolve and reject. And so these two arguments, this might seem a little bit weird, but these two arguments here are both also functions. And these functions are basically what you can use to either handle the resolution or rejection of your promise. And so what we want to do for this challenge is we want to just simply call the resolve function, and you can see that the resolve function takes an optional value, which is basically the value which is going to be provided when the promise resolves. So I can just pass in we can pass in basically anything here for the sake of the tests. We just don't want to pass in undefined. So if we left this empty, this would be basically providing undefined. And so we just want to pass in some other value here. So I'm going to say my promise has resolved. Okay. And then let's bring back this code here and let's pass in this promise callback to our promise. And so now you'll see that this is all type checking correctly. And so with that, let's go ahead and just run the code and see how we're doing. All right, so this passes the tests. Okay, that's great. So this is basically the solution for this challenge. And before moving on, I want to stay and just kind of discuss this a little bit more, because promises are a little bit challenging to wrap your head around at first. And they are a little bit more complex to work with. So let's just walk through this a little bit more and kind of see what's going on. So again, we're creating a new promise here, and we're passing in this callback function. And we defined this callback function separately like this, but we could also just simply define it as an inline anonymous function right here. So we could just open up a new function, and we can provide resolve and reject arguments, and then we could just immediately say resolve with another string here. So this also would work completely fine. You can just pass in a resolution function just like this. And so what's happening here is that the new promise code right here is going to create a new promise. So if we take a look and hover our variable here, my promise, we're seeing that this is of a promise type. So this is creating a new promise, which is being stored in this variable, my promise. And in our case here, the promise is going to basically resolve right away with this value here. But the promise is something that can wrap some kind of asynchronous code, which may resolve at some point in the future. And so in that case, or actually technically even in this case here, the promise is not going to fulfill or complete to this resolved value until sometime later in the future. And that's really the key concept with promises. So if I was to console.log my promise here, okay, it would still pass the challenge, but you'll see that I get this object thing over here in the console. So this is actually some kind of promise object, and it is not yet this string the promise has resolved. So in order to actually get this resolved value, we would need to somehow await for the resolution of this promise. We would need to somehow wait for the promise to actually resolve itself. And so we will see how to do that in a few of the future challenges, and you may kind of have an idea based on the previous challenges that we could use an async function to await the resolution of this promise. But just in the interest of making this video not too long, we'll save that for the other challenges. For here, the key idea is to just get familiar with how to create a promise and to start to become familiar with this idea of passing in this callback function and starting to understand how the role of the callback function is basically to be used by the promise to call one of these functions here when the promise is resolved or rejected. And then these functions essentially allow you to pass a value back from the promise when it is resolved or rejected based on what happens. So again, we'll see that in a little bit more detail in the future. But for now, the key takeaway is just this basic notion of creating a new promise and then passing in this promise callback. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and wrap up this video lesson, and we will get more into the details of how promises work in the next few challenges.